Welcome to The East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
Welcome to another edition, one that comes after a big break. We are academics, so it's difficult, I guess, to avoid following the academic calendar, even in recording the podcast. So the last one we recorded over the summer. Now we are back on campus. This is week one of teaching. Both of us have been teaching. The campus looks great. It's full of students who I sometimes liken to flocks of seasonal birds. You know, they go away, they come back, but it's always a great feeling to be back on campus, which is full of students. So how do you feel, Ra, after the summer?
I feel reinvigorated, Sherzod, reinvigorated and ready to go for another fantastic issue of The East Angle. And we've got so much to talk about today. So it would be great to get your thoughts, and I will probably offer mine as well, on everything from the upcoming leadership elections in Japan to Zelensky conferring a First Order award to Prime Minister Kishida, and the changes in the Japanese establishment, as well as changes in the world out there, not to mention the start of the new football season.
Absolutely. So, Ra, let's start off with the leadership election. We are recording this on Thursday, the 26th of September, and it's literally tomorrow. Obviously,
Yes.
by the time this podcast comes out, it will have happened. But tomorrow, I'm sure Ra will present it much better than I. But there are, as if I understood it correctly, three front runners.
There are.
Two of them at least are, at least in my view, very conservative. Probably one of them is on the right, like you would even say far right. So what's going on? And more importantly, of those three, Ra, who do you think will end up being the leader?
Yeah, this is very interesting, isn't it? It's interesting because, as you say, the leader, it would appear, is going to become Ishiba Shigeru, who, when I first was in Japan studying international politics and Japanese politics, was considered, as you say, maybe not quite far right, but certainly on the right of the centre and quite hawkish amongst that. He was defense secretary at the time. He had a very hard line on North Korea, very hard line on China. And to see him now in a post-Shinzo Abe Japan, looking to supplant Prime Minister Kishida, who we think of as more of a liberal-leaning Prime Minister, it denotes a fairly strong push to the right and certainly to conservatism. And perhaps even more, I wouldn't say necessarily alarming, but certainly concerning, is the fact that the opposition appears to be moving in that direction as well. So we saw the leadership election for the main opposition party in Japan conducted in this last week and month, and former Prime Minister Noda has emerged as the leading candidate for that. And although Noda is certainly not a rightist in any way, he is somebody that has already been part of the conservative establishment. So very striking in that respect. And when you think of the candidates that Ishiba Shigeru has to face off against, Koizumi and Takaichi, they are both, one being a woman, could have revolutionized Japanese politics, been the first Japanese female prime minister, and one being the son of a maverick and quite a kind of progressive character within the conservative elite. This could have been marked a change in a very different direction. So is it old guard replacing the new guard?
Or maybe it's Ishiba Shigeru for the first time. And, just to provide some context, Ishiba Shigeru is probably positioning himself as a centrist, but he's clearly right of center. But he's in the past, he's faced Abe Shinzo so many times. He's lost every time. I think he also lost to Suga Yoshihide once. So he is an old hand. But at the same time, I think it's good that you mentioned that he used to be Minister of Defense. Not only was he Minister of Defense, he's also self-professed military paraphernalia otaku who likes military-themed things, and he's quite hawkish in his responses to Japan's, traditional regional rivals, if I may use that word. But what do you think about Takaichi? Because if Takaichi, probably the only progressive part or side of her would be if she became prime minister, the first prime minister, female prime minister of Japan. But everything else is, I mean, can you say non-progressive? No, I mean, she is so on the right on almost every issue.
Absolutely, but I think the fact that she has been both in charge of sort of economic and socially related issues as a minister, and the fact that she would be the first female prime minister, allow her to gain that centrist or seemingly progressive ground off people like Koizumi. And I think a lot of people coming into this election campaign thought that Koizumi would rise to the top. He's charismatic, he's young, attractive, and so on, certainly compared to his two rivals. But he has been blown out of the water, probably more by Takaichi than by Ishiba Shigeru. So in that respect, I think what will be really interesting to see is, does Koizumi, who after all, this is somebody whose father was not really a progressive, somebody whose father was a maverick, certainly, but actually also had quite a sort of aggressive line on things like North Korea and was very close to Abe. So is this somebody who, if push comes to shove, is going to come on board with Takaichi, as you say, and move his supporters over to her and do so to supplant Ishiba? I mean, this is going to be very interesting to see.
Perhaps inevitably, Koizumi Shinjiro, he is still struggling to get out of his father's shadow. I don't know if he ever will. I'm sure he dislikes this, but dynasties in Japanese politics or Japanese political history have long been, ever since Okubo Toshimichi, the Meiji Restoration, etc., have been quite prominent. There have always been dynasties. Even the last opposition government of Hatoyama in 2009. Hatoyama himself hails from, a leading conservative Japanese politician, Hatoyama Ichiro. So what do you think he should do? Do you think he can persuade not just the voters, but also, all the different factions within the party that he is his own man?
Yes, I think he can. And I think that's because if you think about it, although there has been a lot of publicity around the system of familial lineage through Japanese politics. I mean, you mentioned Koizumi, obviously. You also mentioned Hatoyama. And then we have Fukuda, even Abe, if you think of Kishi being his, a paternal grandfather and so on. So this is a recurring issue in Japanese politics. But if you imagine that Koizumi has a history both of raising what were relatively progressive issues, things like childcare and parental leave and acting as environment minister, all things which would be considered as somewhat progressive issues, and being a leader in those. He is making the argument, I think, inadvertently or perhaps even subconsciously, that this represents a fundamental shift from his parents' generation. And I think realistically, that's probably the most successful route. If you compare it to somebody like Kono Taro, who is now looking near the bottom of this leadership race and has no hope of winning the leadership, who in many respects failed to move away from his father's past. This represents a different model in Koizumi's case. But I think he has been undone by characters around him who he wasn't expecting to take this leadership away from him. But I think if you look at the broader picture, you see that history in politics is central to all of these characters' charisma and to their presentation of their ideas. And you see that even, with characters like Kishida, who doesn't have such an obvious line back to leadership. And indeed, we've seen even this past week with Kishida that it's not something unique to Japan. I mean, we have this conferring, as you mentioned, of this famous order from the Ukraine, from President Zelensky to Prime Minister Kishida. And this is something itself which relies on a long and deep history of Ukraine's relationship to political leadership. So I don't think it's something that Koizumi has to rely on too heavily, and I think it's something that he can probably move beyond. And I think it would be interesting, certainly, to get your thoughts on that broader picture, because we see, Kishida accepting that award as somehow representative of Japan's relationship with Ukraine, but something which then gives it a certain kind of historical authority. Would that be fair to say?
I guess so. Yeah, obviously, just a bit of prehistory on the order of Yaroslav the Wise, first degree, which is usually given to heads of government or heads of state. And going back, it was set up in 1995 by then President Kuchma of Ukraine, and it is clearly ceremonial. So, I mean, I wouldn't attach so much meaning. If there was no war going on currently, I wouldn't attach so much meaning to ceremonial gestures like giving an the head of an allied government that order. These things happen in politics all the time, and then they pose for pictures and then everybody forgets it. But I think one important point to make is that Yaroslav the Wise is a very interesting historic personality because he was obviously the Grand Prince of Kiev, but at the same time, he was also Grand Prince of Novgorod and Rostov, which are Russian cities. Novgorod, especially, goes back to the origins of the current Russian state. Obviously, the current Russian state will also argue that Kievan Rus was also its origins. So you can clearly see that some kind of a rivalry over history that hinges on the personality of this person. And if you look at his personality historically, there are certain similarities with, for example, King Henry VIII in this country, who, with his Reformation, etc., basically what the nickname the Wise, Yaroslav the Wise, historically isn't so much a description of Yaroslav himself, although I'm sure he was a wise leader, but the fact that he was an adept, if you like, of Saint Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. I hope I'm not really, I don't know how exactly to portray this because I'm not an expert on the history of Christianity, but it was clearly a political move on Yaroslav's part because building churches in honor of Sophia was a message sent to Constantinople to reclaim Kiev's own authority as a center of Christianity.
Right. So in that sense, this is exactly what I'm getting at. When we see these leaders evoke this kind of historical lineage, this past, that gives it greater authority. So I think in the case of Japan too, the accepting of this award, right, is that not about trying to demonstrate the fact that there is some sort of historical authority to current Japanese foreign policy, right? I mean, the accepting of the award and the Kishida's specific emphasis on how significant this is because it's coming from that history.
Absolutely. And Zelensky, in the text, if you go to their website of the foreign ministry, Ukrainian foreign ministry, they emphasize the fact that Japan has been a stalwart, an ally of Ukraine, not only in giving money or giving other support. I think 12 billion euros was the amount mentioned, if I remember it correctly, but also for their help in enforcing the sanctions regime against Russia. At the same time as the latest news that I read, that Japan's imports of Russian liquid natural gas are up in August 49%. Obviously, they explain it by shipments, not so much that Japan is suddenly buying more of the LNG. It's probably the LNG that was already bought and just arrived in August in bulk for whatever logistical reasons. But then, there is some irony there because Japan apparently, according to the Ukrainian president, helping impose sanctions on Russia at the same time, of course, buying Russian natural gas.
Well, exactly. And this is why we see all of these are political moves. And I think you see in the war more broadly in Ukraine, Japan being a key figure, China also being a key figure. And from all sides, we have this propaganda war being waged, which, from a Japanese perspective, they need to be careful how they position themselves, right? Because we have a very dynamic situation in East Asia. The war itself is now entering a phase of actually greater dynamism than we've seen for the last several months. We now have the symbolic town of Vuhledar about to fall to Russian forces, it would appear. At the same time, we have the Kursk incursion, so-called, where Ukraine is pushing into actual Russian territory further north. And we're getting these symbolic gestures, for example, Russia using these so-called flag attacks, where they rush into territory that they haven't properly established control over and raise the Russian flag to demonstrate to the world that they're making progress. All of these things suggest that information is key, and that loyalty and actual sort of policy which acts upon supposed historical authority is very limited, right? These are all basically political moves. So, I mean, how do you see Japan positioning itself going forward? Can it really credibly continue to support what seems to be a bottomless pit of need on the Ukrainian side for arms, weapons, supplies, which Japan indirectly facilitates? Or is it going to have to be careful about how closely it aligns with Zelensky's regime in particular moving forward?
I see no reason why Japan should stop supporting Ukraine, specifically also with an eye on China. I think China is always this elephant in the room. Even in our podcast, we don't always talk much about China, and we normally don't have the time. I just overall, like, if you ask me on the war in Ukraine, I think for the past few months, especially because of the summer, but overall, I have somehow phased out of the news, partly because you might call that cynicism, I don't know, but partly because I just generally don't see massive changes on the front line over the past 6 months. You mentioned Ugledar in Russian, or Vuhledar in Ukrainian. That city or town is probably important strategically, has some kind of an importance. But overall, even if it falls, does it change the picture much? I don't think it does. In the same kind of way, the war will continue. It won't really matter if Russia takes Ugledar or doesn't take Ugledar, because ultimately at this stage of the war, and you did mention information, and this is where I'm trying to get at, it doesn't matter, because Russian media will probably portray anything, or can probably portray anything, as victory, unless of course you read special war correspondents, the so-called Z correspondents, on who mostly write on Telegram. So what Japan's position should be on this, I think Japan should wisely, again, my next question was to you about what direction Japanese foreign policy would take in any one case of the three candidates winning the premiership. And even if, say, in the worst case scenario for me, because I think it would be very bad if Takaichi became prime minister. I have nothing against, the idea, or actually I would celebrate the idea that she would be the first female prime minister of Japan. But at the same time, looking back at her record, the controversy about same surname, the law on of couples having the same surname, and all of the other she changed her party after winning, like she basically crossed the line several times. So in that respect, I think even in the worst case scenario of Takaichi becoming prime minister, I think the old hands in the foreign ministry should prevail and should have a level-headed policy. But I'm very curious to hear your ideas.
Well, one of those old hands, of course, would be Ishiba Shigeru. And bearing in mind that there will be a runoff, almost certainly, because they won't get sufficient votes to have 1v1. So you're going to get a three-way runoff. Then you might see deals done. So it's not impossible to imagine a situation or a scenario where Takaichi becomes prime minister and Ishiba Shigeru is given a powerful position within the cabinet, such as foreign secretary or defense secretary, perhaps foreign secretary. If that were the case, then I think we would see definitely a continuation of what has already become a relatively hardline Japanese position. We would almost certainly see a continuation of overwhelming support for Ukraine. But really, the Japanese position is not actually overwhelming support for Ukraine, it's overwhelming support for the United States of America.
Yes.
This is the bottom line. If the United States, as is being hinted at, has somewhat begun to get cold feet about endlessly supporting the war in Ukraine, then I have no doubt that we will see an equivalent change in the Japanese establishment. And you have to look at the amounts that are being talked about. What was the previous level of support for Ukraine. It was something like 60 billion, I think $60 billion with a B. The package being talked about now, currently, as of today, yet tomorrow, with between Zelensky and Biden is, I think, 8 billion or something like that. So a massive reduction. Yes, obviously the
Well,
time frame is
let's not
slightly
forget the 60 billion was not just for Ukraine. That last bill that passed, it also included aid to Israel, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure, but you're still talking about a package which is vastly in excess of what's now being put on the table. And even with that smaller package, there's still a complaint that it's too high. So I would suggest, and if you listen to the military advisors who have not, very quietly, but very forcefully, said to the US foreign policy establishment, we are not going to do this with the long-range missiles. Right? This is the idea that they were going to allow free rein for the Ukrainians to start launching sophisticated missiles at targets deep inside Russia. It seems like the US military has got cold feet over this and they're going to shut that down. So does this not mark a significant change and one that Japan will be forced to follow?
Probably. I don't know. I haven't really followed the latest news. I think everything will hinge on the election in America, which is what? How many days? Like less than
6 weeks?
around 40 days left,
Right.
as we record this. So at the moment, it's not looking likely that Trump will become president, but you never know. The situation has changed drastically several times already. So it's very hard to know. So do you still keep that? Will you still keep your line that we had in one of our previous podcasts that Japan will just continue to
Be a US puppet?
to be a U.S. puppet, to, if not a puppet, then just continue to faithfully follow every change or every turn in American foreign policy?
No.
Okay.
If Trump is elected president, that changes a lot.
How?
Because Japan already has created a narrative at the political elite level that Trump is a disruptor. Trump spells trouble for Okinawa. He spells trouble for the nuclear umbrella. He spells trouble for NATO. Something which Japan has been backing to the hilt. So I think there's no doubt that, not officially, obviously, because it would be seen as meddling, but unofficially, I think there is quiet confidence and hope that Kamala Harris will be elected the next president of the United States. And that will allow the Japanese political establishment to basically roll forward and maintain that very loyal alignment with US foreign policy. If Trump is elected, it opens an opportunity for all kinds of potential changes, including Japanese policy on Russia, on China, on Taiwan.
Speaking of first female heads of government, imagine a situation that Takaichi is prime minister and Kamala Harris is president.
This would be fascinating.
Yeah, it's not unlikely, is it?
Absolutely not. And looking right at this moment, you'd have to say Ishiba Shigeru is still favourite. But if you look at that dynamic that Koizumi is going to be involved in the runoff, and his supporters will then have to go, if he comes third, his supporters will have to go over to either Ishiba or to Takaichi. That's going to be super interesting. And if they flock more to the Takaichi side, she will win the election, and that would present a scenario where it actually becomes the most likely to have a Harris-Takaichi alignment.
Okay, final question on this issue. How do you judge Kishida's time in government? I mean, I know it's a big question, but I'm really curious to learn your position on his legacy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point, isn't it? Or question, really. And likewise, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I see Kishida as having actually overseen a period of relative stability. And if it were not for a series of fairly serious scandals, most of which he was not at fault for, or at least not directly responsible for, things like issues of, although of course some are debatable, but issues of financing and politics, issues of the Unification Church, things around security, social security and social welfare, lots of areas where he has been slammed in the polls, not really through any direct agency on his part, but more the fact that he's been in a position of leadership when these adverse events have taken place. And so I think really it's true that he's lacked charisma at times, And he certainly could have been stronger in terms of redefining Japan in the foreign policy sphere. But having said that, relative stability, and whoever takes over the reins from Kishida is facing a Japanese ship that looks, compared to other G7 states, I would say in relatively good order. But what's your assessment?
Yeah, without praising him too much, I would I
Yeah.
would probably, looking back, I would say he was quietly competent. I think he will probably not go down in history as one of the greatest prime ministers, but I think he did a good job, especially if you compare him to all the prime ministers since the turn of the century. Obviously, you did mention Koizumi Junichiro earlier. Koizumi Junichiro is probably the one that comes to mind first, partly through his, maverick policies, through his bravery, through his, agency as a big political actor, to not for his, you know, when I say bravery, I probably should use the word courage more than bravery. His courage to be not like everybody else and to stand up to, age-old structures and age-old mechanisms that have dominated Japanese politics for long. But even Abe Shinzo, the late Abe Shinzo, who died in tragic circumstances over 2 years ago, who stepped down before securing the title of the longest serving post war Japanese prime minister, even he, who dominated, I would say, the last decade of Japanese politics easily, hands down, there were points when even someone as big as Abe faced that kind of criticism, that it's a very difficult job to be the prime minister of Japan. I guess to be a prime minister of a big democratic economic power. You can look at the predicament of Olaf Scholz, who is being cornered from every side now. You can look at the predicament of so many other heads of state. I mean, Keir Starmer. Just
Absolutely.
look
So-
at what's going on.
so-
So lots of goodwill initially, obviously, when they are elected or when they become leaders, and then when the real work of running the nation, or running the government, actually, running the nation is wrong. Running the government actually comes in, and when they face the full force of media and the other various factions, that's when it becomes really clear how tough it is.
Right. So, in the few minutes that we have left, and this is sad because, of course, it being the start not only of a new semester but also of a new football season, we would have liked to talk about football as we usually do. We're not going to have time to in this edition, but I want to finally get your thoughts then, Sherzod, because there is going to be a new leader in Japan. They're going to face all of those issues that you've just highlighted. They're also facing a mess in the Middle East. They're facing China that is increasingly muscular on their doorstep. So, in these last 2 or 3 minutes, what are the biggest issues that are facing the new Japanese prime minister when they come to power? And how should they deal with them?
I think I'm not going to break new ground on this. I will answer this question, but then, if you don't mind, let's just spend 2-3 minutes on football, just in following tradition. After this, yes, we will finish soon, but I think I won't break new ground when I say the relationship with the U.S. will be absolutely pivotal. I think everybody, including the new leader, whoever that will be looking in Washington November the 5th. I think not just them, but the whole world. It especially this election is so important because Trump just recently said that if he loses, he will probably exit the political scene, although he will probably stay as a force behind Republican politics in America. I think Ukraine remains a big issue for whoever becomes the new prime minister, because as we saw this week, Ukraine is in the news in Japan, and there will be the social issues, the issues that the Japanese economy is facing. I think we don't normally talk about those in the first, like as issues of the first order, but for ordinary Japanese people, the inflation, the free fall of the yen, the rising costs of life. I'm reading a fascinating book about death in Japan by an anthropologist, Anne Allison, currently, and the increasing number of lonely deaths, the increasing social issues, the breakup of the social fabric of the nation. All of these things have to be addressed, And perhaps you could argue that these issues are probably more important than foreign policy in many respects.
I think you're right. In fact, I know a little Japanese boy very well who is already upset about inflation because the umai ball, which used to cost 10 yen, this lovely little sweet, is now going to be 15 yen. So that
Okay.
is a 33% inflationary rise. And that's one tiny example of how this is hitting Japanese people across the board. All fascinating points, all brilliant ideas. I would like to speak about football, but I don't think our team here would thank us for spending
Okay.
the extra time speaking about football. So
Okay.
we will veto that just for today.
Okay, thank
and
you.
we will start perhaps, or perhaps end the next session with that. Thank you, Sherzod, and thank you for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Ra, and thanks to the media team at the University of East Anglia for technical support.
Thank you.
This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA media production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.